This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules that together comprise the lecture that takes the Platonic excerpts from the Republic and uses it as a framework for discussing rationalism and empiricism. Now, there are two real reasons why it's a good time, I think, in the course to introduce this distinction. We find in the recent papers and in the lecture, Bonjour talks about a priori and a posteriori knowledge. And so those modal terms refer to manners by which we come to know something or evidential basis for that knowledge. A priori knowledge is said to be knowledge that is thought to come from or be independent of, rather, experience, whereas a posteriori knowledge is said to be knowledge that results from or in relation to our experiences. A priori knowledge oftentimes supposed to be innate or had as a result of rational intuition, whereas a posteriori knowledge seems to be grounded much more heavily in our sensory experiences and the way in which we understand and use those as evidence. So there's that distinction that Bonjour talks about, and it's interesting and important for us to understand it in relationship to epistemology and to sources of knowledge that we might potentially have as human beings. The second important reason I think why it's useful to introduce this distinction now is that it's really a distinction about the source and really relative importance of these sources for human knowledge. So rationalists and empiricists have different views about the source of at least some of our knowledge and also about the priority of the knowledge that we get from those sources. And so we'll want to look at that, particularly because we notice an important difficulty that arises seemingly for the foundationalists as well as for the coherence theorists, seems to be a difficulty in understanding how it is that those initial sensory-driven inferences or beliefs get their justification without having to be inferred from other beliefs, and then as a result allow us to begin to inject knowledge and justification into our belief and knowledge edifice. We'll begin our discussion by introducing rationalism and empiricism, in part by discussing the historical periods and figures that are most strongly associated with these views, and then by talking about the various tenets that these views hold or reject in relationship to one another. But we'll also try and discuss how, while we think about these views as being fixed in particular time periods in relationship to specific individuals, that the ideas that we associate with rationalism and the ideas that we associate with empiricism actually have a very long presence in the history of ideas, and specifically in philosophical discourse dating back all the way from ancient Greece up until the present time. And so we'll want to take that into account as well. We'll then start to discuss how Plato uses both the allegory of the cave and the divided line to illustrate both his metaphysics and its connection to his epistemology, and how this connection forges this strong rationalism in Plato's epistemology and philosophy of mind. Then we'll go through the two metaphors, the allegory of the cave and the divided line, showing how he actually uses them to make those points. So we'll start now by looking at the history of rationalism and empiricism. Then we'll discuss the two central tenets that together help to define rationalism as a coherent ideology, and we'll use those tenets to understand the denial that really unifies the empiricist doctrine as well. Those two tenets can be kind of summarized as, one, the idea that foundational concepts, important ideas and principles about the nature of the world can be known through intuition and not through sense experience. And when I say foundational, there's an intentional emphasis on the priority of these ideas. They are important ideas, they're not incidental ideas. The second view is that not only do we have these basic injections of justified beliefs or ideas into our knowledge edifice through intuition as a result of our rational natures, but we also are able to propagate those insights through deduction to make larger inferences and to create a larger network of principles spelling out the consequences of those original intuitive insights. The term rationalist most commonly applies to a philosophic school of thought that arose in the 17th century. The origination of the movement is often associated with the work of Descartes and Spinoza, who resided in the Dutch Republic, which is of course the present-day Netherlands, during what is often called the Dutch Golden Age, which is usually identified as between 1581 and 1672. This, of course, is part of the period that's referred to as early modern Western philosophy. Early modern rationalism encompasses Descartes and Spinoza, as well as a group of philosophers that are inspired by their philosophies and that, in fact, developed the ideas through the 17th and into the 18th century. And these include influential figures like Leibniz and Immanuel Kant. Though we most commonly in philosophy associate rationalism with early modern rationalism, rationalist doctrines date back to the very beginning of the Western philosophical tradition, and they can be found in the work of Pythagoras, for example, in the work of Plato, and even in some of the works of Aristotle. Rationalist doctrines, in fact, influenced the Persian polymath philosopher Ibn Sina, who we discussed in the previous lectures in relationship to his elaboration of the cosmological or first cause argument. And he used them and developed them during the Islamic Golden Age, and part of that heritage was passed on to the scholastic philosophers and theologians like Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas, who also were prominent rationalists within their theological tradition. Rationalists are generally thought of as advocating at least one of two central tenets, but usually they hold some version of both of these notions together. So rationalists hold that many of our most important concepts and beliefs are known through rational intuition, as opposed to having their source in experience. And we can see this kind of idea emerge, for instance, in both Descartes and Plato when they talk about their judgments about experience. Their judgments are always actually flowing from, unlike their original conceptions, these judgments actually flow from their rational intuitions. And so Descartes, remember, tells us in that passage about the bit of wax that, in fact, it's his rational understanding of that bit of wax that allows him to re-identify it, and not the individual sensory qualities that he thought originally was driving his understanding, precisely because as that beeswax melts, it loses all of those sensory properties and takes on different ones. And yet Descartes says he finds no difficulty in identifying it as that piece of wax, despite it having changed all of its sensory properties. Rationalists also maintain that we can deduce truths with absolute certainty from our rationally intuited ideas in much the same way that we prove theorems in geometry from axioms. And this is an important analogy within rationalism. This idea that we have these principles or ideas or truths that are given to us in virtue of our being rational creatures, like the axioms that define geometry. For instance, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. These things seem to be known and intuited rationally. They seem to be things that can't possibly be wrong. And we use those rational intuitions through our deduction and our rational inference capacity to expand upon them, and in the case of geometry, to create the entirety of the things that are true about planar geometry. Indeed, for many rationalists, rational intuitions of concepts and principles regulating reality provide the crucial basis for the human ability to understand, anticipate, and judge the world as given through perceptual experience. And this is why many rationalists suppose that reason, in fact, provides us with the means by which we can make sense of sense experience. Immanuel Kant will be a nice example of this. Though Plato was not part of the early modern rationalist tradition, he's clearly a kindred spirit. And we'll see in this selection from the Republic, he discusses sources and natures of knowledge, and his views are in many ways quite representative of rationalism. Now, somebody like Plato here might be much more sympathetic to the empiricist tradition, strongly associated with the British philosophical school of British empiricism, generally agreed to be founded by John Locke or Francis Bacon, depending on who you want to emphasize. And in the next lecture module, we'll turn our attention to empiricism.